Okay, so House of the Dragon Season 2. It's not as good as Season 1. It's not as good as the best of Game of Thrones, which is the bar that you judge the series against, I think. But it's still better than most options that you have for serialized television. Let's start at the end with Rhaenyra and Alicent. So since the beginning of the show, House of the Dragon has attempted to keep these characters, Rhaenyra and Alicent, equivalent to each other, and in many ways this has been successful. Their ages have changed from the book to make them much closer in age, and I liked this a lot early on. It worked really well to see the two factions kind of through their eyes, but the showmakers just won't let this go. I kind of feel like I have to talk about them together because this is how the show tries to present them. So on the one side you have Rhaenyra. She's proclaimed as queen. She's the leader of her faction. She was explicitly her father's heir, and I feel the show kind of skimmed over her dubious actions. For example, her complicity with Vermithor in what happened at the Red Sowing, in the children that she had with Harwin Strong, for essentially abusing Mysaria in Season 2, Episode 6. And then on the other hand, you've got Alicent, who becomes the queen early on in Season 1, but by the end of Season 2, she's very much irrelevant. Her husband is dead. Her sons are both in their own ways incompetent and traumatized. Neither of them are prepared for being king or for being regent, and much of that is Alicent's fault. The offer she makes to Rhaenyra at the end of Season 2, Episode 8 is something monstrous, that her eldest son Aegon will die publicly so that Rhaenyra can be on the throne. It's like the showmakers find Alicent fading into irrelevance just too awful to contemplate. Rhaenyra and Alicent have had two major conversations, one in, I think, Episode 3 in the Sept in King's Landing, and then that meeting in Episode 8 as well. And looking back, I don't really like either of these meetings. Does feel like they don't really want to examine either characters too closely, and this has made both characters flatter and less interesting and less sympathetic and actually kind of more evil. It feels like they're being given kid gloves in comparison to the other characters. For example, Daemon Targaryen. We see this brilliant argument scene between Daemon and Rhaenyra, and then Daemon goes off to Harrenhal for the rest of the season, despite the fact that a lot of people haven't liked it. I really enjoyed the Harrenhal stuff, the visions and his kind of psychological excavation. I think it was one episode too long. It's really changed the character and made him much deeper. So Season 1, Daemon was competent but arrogant and mercurial. And then Season 2 has been like this literal and metaphorical breakdown of his character. So we've gone through all the different layers of his anxieties and his worries and his hang-ups through Aemond, through his mother, through Rhaenyra, through Viserys as his brother, Viserys as his king. Personal ideas about the kingship have been connected very well with the political implications of what was happening in the Riverlands, how he couldn't really handle that, how he was basically outsmarted completely, and it showed that his ambition for the kingship was something that he hadn't thought through in any way. It was something that crushed the unsuitable Viserys who ignored his succession issues, who basically operated things in terms of hopes and wishes. So with Daemon, we saw his strengths, his weaknesses, his hopes, his fears, all the kind of subtleties that go into a real human being. We see Daemon being treated actually quite well by the other characters at Harrenhal. Sir Simon Strong, who's extremely tolerant of what Daemon is going through. We see Alice Rivers, who's very gentle, doesn't force him towards the revelations too quickly. I'd love to see a version of the show where Rhaenyra and Alicent were given similar treatment to Daemon Targaryen. And by that, I don't mean they go on an involuntary Weirwood-inspired vision quest, just that Rhaenyra and Alicent were treated as a bit more three-dimensional. It would really elevate the sense of tragedy around the Dance of the Dragons. She would be someone like Carmela Soprano, for example, Tony's wife, who hates the business that Tony Soprano is in, but captures all the benefits from it. I think Carmela Soprano is an incredibly morally compromised character, That makes her much more interesting than just, she's amazing, things are awful, oh dear. The reluctance of House of the Dragon to properly examine the actions and morality of its female characters, it actually keeps the male characters as the more well-rounded and interesting ones. And I don't think everything about Daemon at Harrenhal was great. For example, repeating the heir for a day speech was a bit lazy. I was not crazy about the conclusion. Having Daemon just back at Rhaenyra's side felt like ultimately a step backwards, even if the character internally had changed quite a lot. So in Fire and Blood, and obviously spoilers for Fire and Blood here, Daemon stays on Rhaenyra's side politically, but it seems like their personal relationship basically ends as the war goes on. Fire and Blood does suggest that there's some kind of big psychological shift in the last month of Daemon Targaryen's life, which I guess is around the character of Nettles, who it looks like is not in the show, is being replaced by Rhaena Targaryen, who we'll come to later. So Daemon and Nettles, they find love, maybe happiness, it looks like, and definitely you get a sense from the book that Daemon finds some kind of contentment. I feel the Harrenhal stuff kind of fills in the gaps and makes a lot of sense in the context of the source material. It's like Daemon finds his peace. So it looks like the show is going to do something different. Maybe will there be, for example, another kind of personal rupture in the relationship between Daemon and Rhaenyra? And if you're going to do that, why break them up just to get them back together at the end of the season? Rhaenys is one of the best handled characters on the show. She's technically a peripheral figure in the coalition. It's a great performance there by Eve Best. This is a politically savvy elder stateswoman who's kind of just there to give advice and who also has a dragon. So Rhaenys was probably my second favourite character for the Blacks, I think. Then you've got Baela Targaryen, Daemon's daughter, who gets reduced a bit to scouting on her dragon and basically being Jace's girlfriend. You've got Rhaena Targaryen, the mopey teenager who abandons her responsibilities to go and find a dragon, who I think was in all 4 of the last episodes, but basically whose plotline could have been dealt with in one long scene. Then you've got the Black Council, lots of potential traitors on there, portrayed as very self-satisfied, not a significant amount of character development. Then you've got Jace, who gets to talk about his parentage a bit, seems like the diplomatic chief of the faction, goes and talks to the Stark, goes and talks to the Aryns in the Vale, goes to the twins and negotiates with the Freys, but doesn't really get treated with the level of respect that those achievements I think deserve. For example, Rhaenyra doesn't really tell him about the plan with the boats full of food, which seems like a bit of a weird choice. And then you've got Corlys Velaryon and Alan of Hull. Alan, for me, is quite unbelievably hostile. Would a medieval lord really tolerate being spoken to the way that Alan of Hull talks to Corlys in the last couple of episodes? I personally don't really buy it. So for a lot of the Blacks, their portrayal feels kind of surface level. How about the Greens? Well, I've already talked about Alicent. How about the other female character for the Greens, Helena? She's kind of presented on the spectrum as a Cassandra, doomed to see the future but also ignored, and the actress gives a great performance. I like watching her on screen, but that's as far as her characterization goes. There's not actually that much there. Aemond is a bit better, the violence, the ambition, the mommy issues, but he's still presented as a bit of an idiot. He doesn't seem to understand the dynamics of the small folk in King's Landing and how they play into the politics of Westeros. It should be obvious that lots of people and not enough food is a bad combination. I guess you could argue that Aemond is so traumatized and angry about his childhood that he's emotionally closed off from everybody. But as much as he was kind of a star of the early season, by the end, he's just kind of a bit of a brute, a bit of an angry man, and that's it. Which is a huge contrast to his big brother Aegon II. After Matt Smith, Tom Glynn-Carney probably gets best served by the script writers. Aegon II is definitely a monster like Aemond, but much more openly angry and much less competent, which makes Aegon for me a far more interesting character because the character is so self-aware. The terrible way he gets treated by his parents, the fact that the only person who cares about him isn't a person at all but his dragon Sunfire. I loved the sad look in the mirror when his lickspittle Kingsguard friends laugh about not following their oath of celibacy. And that's just a few small moments, all of them before Rook's Rest, all of them in the first few episodes of the series, that go so far to humanizing and making you sympathetic for a character who is clearly an idiot. The show makes him a victim as well as a perpetrator. If the show can do so well at making you care for Aegon II, why do 8 entire episodes of the show fail to achieve the same with Rhaenyra? I mean, if we can learn to be sympathetic for a character like Cersei Lannister, for example, even while she's awful, why can't House of the Dragon have done better with both Rhaenyra and Alicent? Criston Cole is another great example of how the male characters have been treated much better by this show. He's clearly a terrible war criminal, but he realises early in the season that he's much less competent than he thinks he is. He's only got himself to blame for the situation he's in, and there's no way out of the situation he's in except for the sweet release of death. He gets lots of wonderful speeches about the nature of the dragons and what they mean for war. He's almost an advocate for the small folk, but far too self-involved to make the jump from personal issues to systemic ones. I feel you could shift a lot of what Criston Cole says to Alicent. Like Cole, Alicent and the Hightowers played the Game of Thrones in a somewhat careless fashion, reached higher than they maybe expected, and don't have the skills to navigate the situation they're currently in. The scriptwriters make Criston Cole stoically accept that he's lost the game, but with Alicent, they're desperate to keep her in. I'd love to have seen a version of the show where Alicent has some kind of breakdown, some kind of retreat to isolation perhaps, in contrast to Rhaenyra's worldly success. So overall, I think the Greens get more character development than the Blacks. But this examination feels like it's tearing down the Greens at the same time as failing to build up Rhaenyra or make up for the relative lack of character development on the Black side in general. Yes, the Black Council are awful, dull caricatures who don't seem able to rustle up a decent idea between them. But saying man bad is just too simplistic to put House of the Dragon up against the very best seasons of Game of Thrones. It does feel like the writers are on Team Black, which makes it feel a bit cheaper than perhaps it should be. I guess it's easier with Season 1. Season 1 was united by Viserys and gave a more balanced examination of the claims of both sides. Season 2, on the other hand, feels quite unbalanced. Game of Thrones is very much about the characters, for me at least, so that's why the characters have been the focus of this review. You could talk also about the plot. So this season was only 8 episodes rather than 10, and it ends with them marching to war, not the actual war itself. It's basically been a season of skirmishes, and it's been well documented elsewhere that that's maybe due to the strike, it's maybe due to budgetary concerns. And if there's only 2 more seasons, yes, I think there's cause to be worried. There's a lot of story still to go, particularly if it's only going to be 16 more episodes. The children in the Vale, for example, Rhaenyra and Daemon's children, are just too young for the story that's going to be happening at the start of season 3. I'm not crazy about the whole Nettles and Rhaena situation, but overall, I don't feel like I can complain too much. I mean, House of the Dragon Season 2, it's flawed, but like I said at the beginning, it's still better than most stuff. So I'll be watching Season 3. Thanks for watching.